Hello and welcome to today's Just Like Us masterclass workshop with Sacha Coward on gender, sexuality in ancient Greece and Rome. We're really excited to see you all here today. This workshop is part of the Just Like Us Diversity Week, celebrating LGBT plus equality in education. This year's Diversity Week is slightly different to usual as we're broadcasting to you live online. Now, before we get into things, can we please all watch this short clip on how to keep ourselves safe online?
Hello. We hope you're enjoying loads of interesting activities for School Diversity Week. Millions of young people are a part of this, and you must keep safe online. So as part of this, we are moderating and disabling public comments you might make on our social media so we can protect your identities. If you do want to communicate something to us, please just direct message us on our social media platforms, or you can email info@justlikeus.org so we make sure that we're still protecting your identity. Justlikeus.org/betteronline has more information about this, and also has some information about where you can go for help or where someone else can go if they need help.
Thank you for watching that. It's really important that we keep ourselves safe online and know how to. We will shortly hear from Sacha, who will give us his talk on gender and sexuality in ancient Greece and Rome. This workshop will run for around 40 minutes, and after the talk, Sacha will be answering some of the questions from our lovely ambassadors who are here with us today. Now, before I hand over to Sacha, let me properly introduce him to you all. Sacha has worked in the museum sector for around 10 years now, where he engages with LGBT plus history. He's given talks and tours on subjects such as LGBT plus characters in video games. He is a self-identified mermaid hunter due to his expert knowledge on mermaid folklore. He is passionate for diversity and inclusion in history, art, and heritage. He believes museums and heritage create powerful places for social change. As part of this, he works on making museums and historical places more LGBT plus friendly. So let me hand over to Sacha, who is here to talk to us today.
Hello there. So my name is Sacha. My pronouns are he, him. And today I'm going to be talking to you about LGBTQ plus people in ancient Greece and Rome. That's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and queer people in ancient Greece and Rome. Now, this is something that I find really fascinating. This is my silly slide. But partly because we talk about the Romans and we talk about the ancient Greeks a lot, all the way from primary school. And this is a really important part of that history that often gets missed out. Now, before we get into the juicy stuff, into the good stories, there's a few things I want to say. Firstly, about language. So when we use words like lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, all those words that we identify with today, they would not have been around in ancient Greece. They're quite modern, a lot of them. Now, we'll find that the origins of some of these words go all the way back to ancient Rome and ancient Greece. But the people living then may have used some of those words to identify by and may not have used any of them at all. So when we talk about, transgender identities in particular, it is quite a complex story when you're talking about something that happened thousands of years ago. And also, just because people were practicing lives that we might think of as gay or bisexual doesn't mean that everything they were doing was okay. And we'll be talking about some of the things that we wouldn't want to bring back, things that we wouldn't want to, take from ancient Greece and ancient Rome to today, because they'd be really, really problematic. Now, another thing I want to talk about is relating to race. So all of the pictures pretty much that I will be showing you today, most of them depict people who would be white or Caucasian. Now, ancient Greece and ancient Rome were actually really diverse places to live in. Their empires spanned across the world with people from Africa and Asia and Egypt intermingling. But a lot of the pictures and depictions we have are painted much more recently by Western artists, and therefore they sort of make all the ancient Greeks and Romans look white. We know from research, like the Museum of London has shown that those Romans living in London were not all white. So if you see that, that's why that is going on there. So to start with, this slide, bunch of weird pictures. Basically, LGBTQ plus identity and Rome and Greece are really strongly linked. The most popular holiday destination for gay men is Mykonos, a Greek island. One of the most popular destinations for lesbian or bisexual women to get married is Lesbos. And even things like RuPaul's Drag Race will occasionally have an entire episode devoted to dressing up drag queens as Greek gods or deities. So why is that? And is that a recent thing? And no, it is not. So the pictures that we have here is on the left, we've got Romaine Brooks. Now, Romaine was an artist. Now, she had romantic relationships with many men and women, but particularly a lifelong relationship with another woman. She also loved identifying as androgynous. She liked it when people couldn't work out whether she was a man or a woman. Now, the grave, the cemetery you see there, is for John Addington Symonds. Now, he was a writer, a gay man who wrote a lot about homosexuality way back in the 1800s, and he was buried in Rome. Then on the bottom right, you might recognize Oscar Wilde there, classic person that we talk about when we're talking about bisexuality and homosexuality among men. So all of these people were obsessed with Rome and Greece, and this is 100, 200 years ago. In fact, the top right thing, you see the International Journal of Greek Love. The term Greek love was used as a code to talk about homosexuality and bisexuality for basically hundreds of years. And the reason being that in ancient Greece and in ancient Rome, there was loads of examples of people living lives that we might refer to as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer. So we're going to start talking about affection between women, romantic relationships between two women. So this is really decayed, and I'm sorry about that, but that's because it got partially burnt by a volcano. This image is from Pompeii. So Pompeii was this really big Roman urban hub that was later destroyed by the volcano Vesuvius. But because the ash covered everything, it kind of preserved stuff. And the image is of two women engaging, they're both naked, in a romantic liaison. In the top right, you'll see a copy of some graffiti. Now, this was found on a wall, and the writing basically speaks about this person's beautiful thin arms and how beautiful her lips are. Now, the fascinating thing about the writing is in Latin, we can see that the person writing it is using the feminine version of I. So she is writing about another she. Now, the image below on the right, the picture of all the kind of women draped over each other, is meant to depict Lesbos. And that's where we're coming to now. So Lesbos was an island. It's in the Aegean. You can still go there today. Now, the Isle of Lesbos is famously home to a woman called Sappho. Now, no one really knows what Sappho looks like, but the image on the left is a kind of bust that was supposedly made of her. And this is a painting that someone has done of her. Now, she was a poet. And for being a woman in ancient Greece, where women weren't really respected all that much, she grew to be one of the most respected poets of all antiquity. Now, her poems were written on papyrus, and as you can see, sometimes only fragments remain, so we can only put them back together from little jigsaw pieces. Now, fascinatingly, some of them were even found wrapped around Egyptian mummies. So these the bits and bobs that we've managed to put some of her poetry and translate it back into English show that she often wrote about loving women. So one of her poems is about going to a party and she sees a man and she describes the man as looking like a god. And for a moment you might think, well, maybe she fancies the dude. But she then moves on to say the reason he looks like a god is because he's sat next to the most beautiful woman in existence. And actually the whole poem is about the woman. So Sappho inspired a word, and that word is sapphic. We use the word sapphic to describe anything that has a kind of lesbian or same-sex between women romantic edge to it. Also, Sappho lived on the Isle of Lesbos. The word lesbian comes directly from that word. So we see that, yeah, there were definitely women who were living these lives where they were not necessarily just being with men. They were not just having romantic relationships with men. Another cool thing, which we'll come back to a bit later, is the idea of warrior women. So the Greeks and Romans were obsessed with warrior women. In particular, they spoke about a group of Spartan women. This is the image on the far left. And these were women who were incredible fighters who did not like the company of men and, quote, they preferred the affections of other women. They were also obsessed with the idea of the Amazons. The Amazons were a group of women that would not allow men to live with each other. And there were loads of aspersions that maybe these Amazonian women were actually also lesbian or bisexual. We'll be coming back to the lesbians later. Now, I've thrown in a little picture of Wonder Woman because that's quite a cool little connection. So also, when you think of some of the most popular films about ancient Greece and ancient Rome that have come out recently, the one I think of is the 300 series. So that's the bottom left, with a whole group of like hunky men, all with swords, shouting at the camera, very masculine. Well, actually, yes, but also very gay. So one of the big groups that were popular in the Spartans, which were a real group of people, was known as the Band of Thieves, or the Sacred Band of Thieves. It's also been nicknamed the Band of Lovers. The idea being that two male warriors would be put together in a partnership as a couple and encouraged to have a romantic relationship so that they would fight even harder together. So the image on the plate on the right, that is an image of a band of brothers. These are two Spartan warriors who would have lived and slept together. Now, not all love between men that is celebrated in Greek and Roman culture would be seen as okay today. So there's the idea of the Catamite. So this is an image from the British Museum. This is known as the Warren Cup. And on the right, there is an image which is an erotic Roman knife handle. Both of these depict an adult man with a younger boy. Now, many of these young men would have been of age. They would have been 20-year-olds or teenagers, but there is definite evidence that many of them would have been underage. And these were known as catamites, or young boys who would be taken by older men basically for sex and for romantic relationships. And these boys couldn't obviously consent by today's notions. The idea being that the young boy would be raised into manhood by the older man, and the older man could pretty much do whatever he wanted. So we definitely don't want to celebrate that side. Now, an example of a story where you can really see this happening is between Antonyus and Hadrian. So Emperor Hadrian, who was famous for creating Hadrian's Wall, well, he also had a lover called Antonyus. Now, Hadrian was married, he had a wife, but they did not get on well at all. And when he was traveling around Europe, he went to Greece and he met this young Greek man called Antonyus. Now, Antonyus didn't come from a wealthy background. He wasn't a lord or a prince, but Hadrian fell in love with him and they became inseparable. And so Hadrian and Antonyus traveled around together, and Antonyus was Hadrian's consort. There was a lot of gossip about what they were getting up to, and the fact that Antonyus had so much power over an emperor. Now, tragically, Antonyus drowned in the River Nile in Egypt. Now, no one knows whether this was an accident, a murder, or a suicide, but after it happened, Hadrian was devastated. So devastated that he created a city in Egypt, which is called Antinopolis, after Antonyus. He even created a constellation. So the constellation of Antonyus is now known as Aquila, or the eagle. But back in the day, only 100 or so years ago, Antonyus was itself a constellation. He loved his lover so much, he put him into stars. Now, an example of transgender or intersex identities in classical civilizations is probably best seen in the Amazons. We touched on them earlier, but I'd like to go back and think a bit more about who they were. Because the Amazons were these warrior women. They all fought together and men were forbidden from mixing with them. Although they were a myth, they were a legend alongside Hercules and Achilles. They were just a story. Or were they? Because there's great evidence that these were actually based on a real group of people who were known as the Scythians. So the Scythians were a group of warriors who basically were all on horses, and they would fight together. And they particularly had a different understanding of gender. So rather than just having men fight and the women stay at home, men and women were trained to be fighters from the age of 10, and they were all aboard horseback. Now, this image on the left, the gold image, is something known as an Inari. So an Inari was a Scythian who was basically kind of a witch doctor or a powerful priest. This would be someone who was assigned male at birth, but then would transition to become a priestess, a sorceress. The image in the middle is an approximation of what an Inari woman might have looked like. Now, these Inari and these Scythians are possibly where the idea of the Amazons come from. So I love the idea that the Amazonian women was actually based on a group of a mix of cisgendered lesbian women who were fighting together and transgender women all living and attacking the Roman Empire, to such an extent that the Romans and the Greeks were terrified of the Amazonians. Now, the last example I want to talk about is of a saint. So this is an image of Saint Hilaria. So Saint Hilaria was the daughter of a great emperor. Now, I wonder whether Hilaria would have used the term daughter, and I might even just prefer to use the pronoun they to describe them. Because Hilaria lived their life, or at least most of their life, as a monk, as a male monk, and changed their name from Hilaria to Hilarion, which is the masculine version. So we know that there were examples of people in the Roman Empire who would be born in places of great privilege at least, and could then transition to be a different gender or something in between the ascribed genders of male and female. And you can see by these depictions, so these are both religious depictions of Saint Hilaria, and they show that they're kind of androgynous. The person who's trying to depict it is mixing both masculine and feminine traits together. So Hilaria or Hilarion is a fantastic example of the fact that people who are living between those binaries of male and female have been going back since the dawn of time. So the evidence that we have, we sum it all up together in ancient Greece and in ancient Rome, is that they had a very different attitude to gender and sexuality. It was okay for a man to take another man as a lover. Now, there were things about the idea that one of them, the one who was active, was definitely a better thing to be than the one that was passive. And also, if you were born a woman or you were assigned female at birth, it was very difficult to express yourself sexually in any way, because both Rome and Greece were patriarchies. They were very much about men. They celebrated manhood. At the same time, you have people like Sappho who were living lives, influential lives, where they were singing about their love as a woman for other women. So when we look back at the history of Rome and Greece, I don't want us to think this is an ideal place that we should all go back to. This is a perfect idyll. No, it was really problematic. There were loads of issues going on. But at the same time, we can learn that people like us, gay, queer, trans, lesbian, non-binary, bisexual, they have been around since the dawn of time. Thank you.
So thank you for that, Sacha. That was great. I really enjoyed such the variety of historical sources you were using there. So we're now coming to the question and answer part of this workshop, and we have some questions for you from our ambassadors today. We have our first question from our ambassador, Gurke.
Hello, Sacha. Great talk. Thank you very much. Hi. I would like to ask you, did transgender people actually exist in ancient Greece and Rome?
Yeah, so I can answer that with a definite yes, but. So yes, people who today may have defined as transgender or even non-binary definitely existed. I gave some examples there. So there is evidence, for example, that the Amazons were based on a group of people called the Scythians or the Scythians. There's even some evidence that some of those people who were assigned male at birth, they were riding horses. They would actually take some of the fluids of their female mares in estrus and would use that to biologically transition. There are examples of people assigned male at birth, castrating themselves and living their lives as women. So people were even transitioning as well. Now, the thing is, the word transgender did not exist. That was not a concept that people would have had in ancient Greece and Rome. What people would probably have done more likely is just taken it at face value. If I am faced by someone who has got long hair and they are living the life of a woman, they're a woman. If I see a warrior and they're fighting, then they're a man. Their birth is kind of irrelevant. It wouldn't have been a perfect place because things were very rigid. If you were born a woman, a whole set of expectations would be laid out for you as soon as you were born. And if you were born a man, a whole set of expectations would be laid out for you. So to divert those, I'm sure it would have caused a lot of friction. I'm not saying it would have been easy, but there were definitely many examples of people, not just in ancient Greece and Rome, throughout time, history, and place, who defied gender, who changed it, who twisted it, who threw it away, who took one bit and one bit of another and stuck it together. That's been going on for an eternity. In fact, the idea of just being cisgender, that's the weird thing. That's a very weird concept, and that's quite modern.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting. So we're going to turn to our second ambassador now, which is Ben, who has a question for you.
Hi, Sacha. What can we learn from myths and legends, and why are people so fascinated by them today?
So the interesting thing with the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans is myths and legends is a tricky one because it kind of blurs the line. Sometimes you don't know whether you're reading something that is history and fact or whether it's a myth and a legend. So the great example of that is the Amazons. So the Amazonian women, as they appeared in the stories of Hercules, those are probably not accurate and not real, but they may well have been based on something that is real. So firstly, if we look at myths and legends, we can see that they're telling stories of what happened to real people. As a great example, the gods of ancient Greece, they had loads of gods and none of them were perfect. They were always fighting. They were always arguing. They were petty. It's a bit like watching an episode of RuPaul's Drag Race where they're all bickering at the end. That was the ancient Greek gods for you. And that's because they represented how people were. They were meant to be like the embodiment of how real people are. So when you read about a legend or say a story of, say, Zeus falling in love with a young boy called Ganymede, you can see that this was also happening in real life. In fact, we see the same example with the Emperor Hadrian and Antonyus. So when you're reading a myth, you are hearing something about the people who are writing those myths. You're hearing how they saw the world. Also, it's really important for us as queer people, as LGBTQ plus people, to see ourselves in those stories. I heard myths and legends all the time as a kid, but I rarely got told the stories that had people like me in it. So I like to find those stories because it reaffirms that, we don't just exist throughout time, place, and history. We exist in fantasy as well, in stories and in art and doodles. And it's important to remember that we're not an addition to the world. We've always been there. We're core and we're central. So reading myths and legends with queer people, with gender swapping, with men who love men and women who love women, I find it really inspiring because it reminds me that we're always here and we always will be.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. I really liked that, finding LGBT plus stories everywhere. So now we're going to go to our third question from Iona.
Hiya. I wanted to ask, are there any other cultures whose LGBT plus history interests you?
I am interested in LGBTQ plus stories all over the world. So I just picked the Romans and Greeks because I was given 20 minutes. And, I could speak for hours and hours. I could bore you all to death if we were to travel all over the world. If you pick any civilization, any group of people you can think of, they have got LGBTQ stories. So we're talking Asian storytelling, Chinese mythology, Japanese mythology, Vikings, full of gender fluidity, full of characters that transition and change. Every single society, pretty much pre-Christianity especially, the introduction of Christianity made things a little bit more uniform. But prior to that, there are so many examples of people living lives that we might describe today as queer, as gay, as bisexual, or transgender. So, yeah, I would really encourage you, I know that this isn't very good if you're a proper historian, but go onto Wikipedia. They actually have pages which have examples of LGBT people in different civilizations. Look up the Aztecs, look up like ancient China, look up any civilization that you're into, find those stories because there are so many of them. The thing is, we see history that happened a long time ago through the lens of the people that write the history books or the people that built the museums 100 or so years ago. And most of them were white, cisgender, straight men. And most of them didn't want to tell those kinds of stories. And so we've had them all filtered out for us. So it's our job to go back and go, actually, let's go back to the original source. Because the original source is full of diverse stories that aren't getting told today. So that's that's a challenge. Go on Wikipedia and look it up because I promise you there isn't a single civilization or group of people where there are not LGBTQ plus identities.
That's really interesting. I will be doing that. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really interesting how you can find LGBT history among all countries, cultures, and history. So we're moving on to our fourth question from Marco.
Hi, hello. My question would be, where else can I go to find out about this kind of thing or the hidden histories if I'm interested in? And I think you already covered part of it in your answer.
So I think, yeah, you can start. There's no shame in starting on Google. Okay, so you will be told if you're writing a history book or an essay for a PhD or a master's thesis, yes, you don't want to be citing Wikipedia in your final essay. You want to go and find those initial kind of texts so you can make sure you're being accurate. But it's a good place to start. There is a lot of resources online. Now, another thing I would recommend is using Google Scholar. So if you search Google Scholar, you can look through abstracts and papers that have been written, research papers, some of which you might even be able to order and see the originals, but they give you a flavor of what's going on. Now, tragically, at the moment, it's quite difficult for me to give you one place where all of this exists. I would recommend places like search LGBT History Month. Now, whilst that happens in February, it's actually all year round that they're gathering information. You'll find loads of resources there. I think there are a number of websites, including Just Like Us, which are promoting LGBTQ plus inclusion in education, so you can have a look at those. There are a few books out there. So one of them is called The Little Book of Queer History, that was written in partnership with the British Museum. But as a start, I would start with something like just Google, just do a few Google searches, see where you end up. And then once you've got a bit more of a specialist interest, that's when you want to buy a book. That's when you want to go to the British Library and find something, or go to a museum and ask to see a collection item. But just to pique your interest, starting online is absolutely fine.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Thank you. I know I'll be Googling some of the stories that I've been hearing about today. So we're going to turn to our last question, who is from Daniel.
My question is, how would you recommend bringing in LGBTQ plus history into the curriculum, or into classroom, sorry, when it's not currently in the school curriculum?
Yeah, I think the thing with LGBTQ plus history is it's important that we kind of give it its own space to breathe, because if we don't do special events, do special programs, have a history month, then it always gets missed off. It always gets left out. But at the same time, in theory, the perfect future for me is where we stop talking about it as a separate history. It's not a separate history. LGBTQ plus history is as much my history as a cisgender gay man as it is a straight person. It's part of our human story. So when it comes to how it should be approached in schools, I don't think it should be approached any differently to anything else. Imagine if we took something really random that we said, oh, you're not allowed to talk about potatoes at school. That's a really weird thing to do. You might talk about that in cooking class. You might refer to it in history. It might come up in art. It's just a thing. It's a thing that appears in loads of different areas. Queer history, much more important than potatoes. But the idea being that it is just part of everything. In a maths class, when you're doing, if so-and-so's has got 2 friends and they're married too, and you have to do all this stuff to work out how many people, why not have a same-sex couple in there? The lessons that we teach should replicate the world that we live in. And the world that we live in includes queer people. And so trying to kind of separate it out as regular history and queer history is really bizarre. It's a very strange thing to do. The stories that I've brought today, the ones I was talking about in Roman and Greek history, those weren't written in separate books. The Romans didn't have one book for the normal history and then they wrote all of the queer stuff in a separate book. It's all mixed together. It's us that have done this weird job of going, this Victorian thing of going, this is inappropriate. We can't talk about that. We'll just talk about these. And only now are we kind of going, hey, these things that you've pulled apart, they're actually part of the story. And if we want to understand who we are as people, we have to understand all kinds of voices, diverse voices. So just don't overthink it. We need to get over this Victorian attitude that LGBT stories are inappropriate and just include them across the board.
Thank you.
Thank you to all our ambassadors. There were some great questions posed there. Now, Sacha, I believe we have an activity for you to explain for people to do after this workshop.
Yeah, so my plan is for you to have a little think about, imagine you built a time machine. Imagine you're Doctor Who, and you could go back to ancient Rome or ancient Greece. It don't matter exactly when or exactly where. I want you to imagine what it would be like to live as a contemporary person today in ancient Rome and ancient Greece. So I've given you some examples of what the world might have been like for people whose gender identities didn't fit a binary, for people who love people of the same gender. And I've also said that some of those things might be a bit problematic. It might have been really difficult for women, for example, and also gay men. Yes, there were some loving relationships, but there were also some relationships that we think were terribly inappropriate today. So if you were to go back in time to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, what would your experience be there? So if you are a queer person, think a little bit about how you might find that. If you're an ally or a heterosexual person, just think about what might seem different then as it is today in terms of gender and sexuality.
So I'd like to say a massive thank you for Sacha for speaking with us today and all the ambassadors with their great questions. Remember, there are loads of awesome masterclasses running all week, and you can find them at www.justlikeus.org/masterclasses. If you're on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram, you can always find us at Just Like Us UK. If you've enjoyed Sacha's talk today, then you can find more from him on his social media at Sacha Coward. Remember, please do participate in the activities afterwards. We'll be posting those on our social media to remind you all. You can always direct message us here to let us know how you're taking part in School Diversity Week, but please remember to always stay safe online. We have a special page on the Just Like Us website with tips on how to stay safe online, which is www.justlikeus.org/betteronline. So once again, thank you all for joining us today. I hope you're all enjoying and involving yourself in School Diversity Week. So a final farewell and thank you for Sacha for speaking with us today.